Now let's talk about Vellum solver. Vellum is used to create the soft body simulation. Vellum can also be used to create the grain simulation. Vellum is basically the continuation of the pop grains that we have talked about. Let's see how how we can configure Vellum grains to create soft body. I'm going to create a geometry node in here, empty geometry container, and let's dive inside. And first I'm going to create a cloth simulation, and for creating the cloth I'm going to add a simple grid. Let's add this, and I'm going to lower down its overall size because right now we have a very big size, and you know that Houdini works in meter, and right now we are working with a very big cloth. I'm going to just change this to some lower value. Let's in here we need to create a vellum constraints because it is a granular simulation. As you know, we have created a pop grain node. If I were to add the pop grain source, sorry, because we are in the geometry, we have this grain source and not the pop grain. Let's add the grain source onto the grain source, and in here, as you know, right now all of our source is gone because it is expecting a solid mesh. And if you are working with these thin meshes, I can go into the mode and change this to sheet, and now we are scattering bunch of points and all of them has scale value. If I were to enable change this to lit sphere, and here I can see that we have all of the particles with the scale value. And to actually make all of these points connect together, we can create the constraint. If I enable the explicit constraint to better visualize the constraints, I'm going to make the visualization to points. Let's come over here and change the visualization to points. And now you can see that we have these lines. All of these lines are basically, they are connecting all of these grains particle. And right now some of them are not connected. That is because of the search radius. Let's increase the search radius, and as I continue to increase, here as you can see we are creating more and more constraints, and all of the grain particles will going to be connected through these constraints to create the soft body simulation. Vellum is work just like that. If I were to create a Vellum node, I'm going to hide this point display. In here I'm going to add a Vellum constraint node. To create the Vellum, you must start with the Vellum constraints. Let's add a Vellum constraint node. Let's add this and connect this. That is the geometry that I want to convert this into Vellum geometry. Let's view this, and right now nothing has happened. We can see some of the mesh. Now our mesh got triangulated, and that is because of the visualization of the constraint. But if you take a look at the geometry, I'm going to create a null in here and attach this, and let's view the null. Right now we are passing through our original geometry, and the middle one is creating the constraint. That is what important. Let's view the constraints, and now we can see these constraints. Now what the Vellum constraint is doing, it's not scattering points as we had with the grain source. If I were to use the grain source and add this, you know that with the grain source, let me change this to sheet, we are basically scattering bunch of points, and we can control them by lowering down the number of point separation. We are scattering points onto the surface. But the Vellum constraint node, it's using the points from your input mesh. If I enable my points, we have all of these points. Now the Vellum constraint using all of these points as grain particles. Now it thinks that these are the grain particle. Let's not scatter more points, but use the original points as grain. And in between them, all of these, we have the geometry, these edges, these lines. It will use these edges as a constraint. Right now we are adding more constraint, and that is because if we go into the Vellum constraint, we have the triangulation, and right now it says alternating. I can change this to none, and now you can clearly see that we are not adding triangulation, and we are just straight using all of the edges that are actually present on this mesh, or of these edges. Now these will represent as a constraint. I can go into the Vellum constraint. Let me enable the parameter, And we have all of these particles. You know that all of these granular, they need the p scale, and this vellum constraint is also setting the p scale. And we can visualize. Right now we are using the distance along edges constraint, and if you type in here another constraint, I'm going to type in a vellum configure cloth, and here we have the vellum configure cloth. If you add this, it is still an a same vellum constraint node. Here you can see, if I enable the parameter, here it says vellum constraint. If I enable its parameter, it still says vellum constraint. It's just same node, but it's just configured to the cloth preset. I can go into my original constraint that we just created, vellum constraint. Let's enable its parameter and go to the constraint type. Let's go in here, and here you can see we have several different types of the constraint. I'm going to change this to cloth. And when you change this to cloth, it will just add some attributes to all of our these edges. These edges will going to be converted into constraint, and we are going to be simulating solving these constraints over time to create the soft party. Now I want to visualize the thickness of our these points, because now they will going to be grain points. I can visualize them onto the thickness. Let's change this to set uniform value. First we need to add the thickness. Right now we are using the thickness of 0.01, and now we have the visualize thickness option appeared. Let's click on it, and here as you can see we have the scale visualize. And if I were to increase the thickness, and here as you can see we are basically increasing the p scale of our original points mesh. I'm going to change this to 0.01 because we have the constraint between them, and these edges, these constraint will going to hold all of these particles together. We are going to simulating these constraints, and they will keep apart their distance. Now all we need to do is add a vellum solver. Let's go into the vellum constraint, and I'm going to uncheck this visualize thickness. Let's add a vellum solver node. Vellum solver, and it has all of these three corresponding. I'm going to just remove the vellum cloth. Let's connect the geometry and the constraint, and maybe let's connect this last one that is for the collision. Let's view this, zoom out, and let's hit play. And here you will see our cloth is falling due to the gravity. Let me hide the point display, and I'm going to just move my grid up. Let's change its center and move this up, and let's add something so that we have something to collide with. I'm going to add a simple sphere node in here. Let's add a polygonal sphere, and I'm going to connect this onto the last one. The last one is for the collision geometry. You can connect this in here, and it will going to be passed through, or you can connect this in here. It's the same thing, whichever way you want to connect it, because the last one is for the collision and it's going to be passed through from all of the nodes. I'm going to just connect this in here for the sake of the arrangement. Let's go into the vellum solver, and let's hit play. And here as you can see we have our cloth simulation, very basic cloth simulation. Let me enable my real-time playback. Let's hit play again, and there you go. And vellum work best when you have the triangulated mesh. Right now we are using these regular grid. If I were to continue increasing its rows and columns, because if we want to pick up more details, if we want more wrinkles in our cloth, we must need the resolution. Let's continue adding more resolution. And if you take a look at the vellum solver, right now it's looking smooth, and I cannot see much of the problem by using this regular method. And right now we have this cloth stretchiness. If you take a look, we have our cloth that is stretching a lot, and I can adjust its property, its stretchiness property, by going onto the vellum constraint, because that is the node responsible for setting all of the physical attribute. Let's go into the vellum constraint, and down here we have the option stretch. So the cloth constraint is made out of these two constraints. We have the stretch and we have the bend constraint. And stretch, onto the stretch we have the stiffness, and in front of it we have the multiplier. We are multiplying this value by 10, which means that basically we are creating an infinite stretch stiffness. If I were to lower this multiplier down, let's say if I were to lower this value down to 0.1, which means that you know that 1 is going to be multiplied by 0.1, and it means that the stretch stiffness is going to be 0.1. And now if I were to hit play, and here you can see, because we have a lot more stretchiness, all of our simulation is breaking. Maybe let's lower this value, increase this to a higher value to 100, so that we have somewhat stable simulation. And here you can see, because of the low stretch stiffness, our cloth is stretching a lot. Let's change this to infinite. Even though we have the infinite, I can still see some stretchiness. And that is because we actually need to increase the number of substeps. As you know, whenever working with grains and this Vellum solver, it's basically the continuation of the grain. It is also called the XPBD, and the pop grains are called PBD. So the XPBD is a newer research, and it is a continuation of the pop grains, and basically it's just a grain simulation. And to in grains we need to increase the substeps. In here we have the constraint iteration, and right now we are using with 1 substeps. Let's increase this to 5 substeps. Let's start with that and let's hit play. And now we should see somewhat accurate result, and I can still see some stretchiness, and that is because it is now coming from our this regular geometry arrangement. And whenever you are working with soft bodies, whenever you are working with Vellum, it is best to triangulate your mesh. Vellum work best onto the triangulated mesh, and to actually create this triangulated, we have a node called remesh. Let's add a remesh node, and let's connect this. And what this remesh node will do, it will just convert your input mesh into triangles. Let's bring up the parameter, can increase the iteration, and that will just even out the triangles. And I can apply some smoothing in here. And to actually add more triangle, we need to lower down this target size. And if you lower this value down, basically we are creating more and more triangles, more and more smaller triangles. And same way, if you were to increase this size, we are basically creating bigger triangles, and they will going to be a less triangulated mesh. I'm going to lower this value down to create a reasonably high resolution mesh. I think that mesh is looking fine. Let's connect this in here. Let's go into the Vellum constraint, and let me go back and let's change the triangulation method to default, which was the alternating. Now that we are working with the triangulated mesh, let's go into the Vellum solver again and let's see. Let's hit play, and now it is calculating. And here you can see, now we do not see the stretchiness. Now our cloth is behaving accurately, and it is always recommended to use the triangulated mesh. Let's go into the Vellum solver, and now I think we do not need the 5 substeps right now. I'm going to change this to 1 and let's hit play. And here you can see our simulation is still accurate. Let me go into the grid, and maybe let's increase our cloth size to a bigger. And right now our this visualization looks weird, but let's view the Vellum constraint and let's view the Vellum solver again. Let's hit play. It is a triangulated mesh, but right now it's just visualizing as we have our quad plane. Maybe let's refresh our viewport. Let's go into the animation editor and let's go into the scene view again. And it's still not refreshed. Maybe let's add a null in here. And I'm going to view this with our mesh. It's still not. Let me see. Okay, no, it was visualizing correct, but the remesh is creating these smooth triangles. I thought that it was a viewport problem, but that is our mesh. That's how our mesh looks like. Let's go into the remesh. Because we have changed our size, I'm going to lower down its iteration to the default. Make all of these parameters to the default, and let's lower down this size. And by lowering this down, here as you can see, we are start to getting more triangle. And now we have the good triangulated mesh. Let's go into the Vellum solver. Let's go back and hit play. And now, because we have added more triangles, now I can see lot more wrinkles and lot more folds in here. And we are picking up all of our details in here. Now I can go into the Vellum constraint node. Let's come over here onto the stretch. Now if I were to change the stretch, if I want my cloth to be stretchy, I can just lower this value down. Let's change this to maybe 1000 and let's hit play. And here you can see we have reasonable stretchiness. If I were to change this to 100 again to the default values, and I think the 100 value is just too low and our simulation is just breaking. Let's change this to an infinite, and that is the stretch stiffness. And down here we have the option for the bend stiffness, and that control how much our cloth is allowed to bend. And here you can see our cloth is bending, all of these constraints are bending, and that's what creating this cloth like simulation. And if I were to increase the stiffness, right now we are using the 0.1 value. If I were to increase this, here you will see that our cloth will act like as it is made out of a metal sheet because it's very hard to bend. Let's hit play, and here you can see we are still getting the bendiness. Even though we have the very high value of stiffness, we are still getting the bendiness, and that is because whenever you are working with these very high value, you must go into the Vellum solver and increase the number of substeps. I'm going to increase the number of substeps, and let's hit play one more time, and here we will see the difference. And here as you can see, now we have animation that looks lot more different. We have the simulation that is much more different. Let's hit play again, and here as you can see, I can increase the constraint iteration. Let's maybe increase this constraint iteration to a very high value, and let's hit play. And the simulation will take longer to simulate, but we will get an accurate simulation. And here as you can see, now this metal sheet is bending, and it's acting like we have this metal sheet. And because we are working with very high bend stiffness onto the Vellum cloth, bend stiffness, this material is very hard to bend. Same thing, if we want to create the cloth, we need to lower this value down. I'm going to lower this down to 0.1 because it is a cloth. It should be easier to bend. And because we are working with cloth, let's go into the Vellum solver, and we do not need that many substeps. Let's change this to 1 and the constraint iteration to 100. Both of these values are just fine. And we have our very basic cloth simulation.